In this video, I'm going to help you set up your controls in your new OH-58 Delta Kiowa Warrior. The footage used in this video is pre-release software and is intended for promotion and training purposes. Its visual and audio qualities may not represent the final product. Alright guys, welcome aboard the OH-58 Delta Kiowa Warrior. You have probably just purchased this module and you're trying to figure out where you need to map stuff, so let's talk about what we need to have mapped. And I'm going to kind of look at this from a standpoint of what do I have mapped, and then I'll try and highlight the things that I don't think that you'll need, you know, if you're button limited, if you don't have a lot of options. Now I do want to draw attention to modifiers. I don't know if everyone understands this, but if you are button limited, this is definitely something you should look into. You can add a modifier like a shift button. You just go over to modifiers, add, you pick your device. You can actually select a button on your device to act as essentially a shift button, thereby allowing you to double or even triple the number of buttons that you have on your switch, so you can devote one button to that shift and then use another button on the on other devices. It doesn't even have to be the same device, and you can expand your button selection. So just something to keep in mind. But with the 58, we really probably won't need to use this because there's really not that many buttons that we need to worry about. All right, so let's start out by looking at our Cyclic. There are a lot of buttons here, but we don't necessarily need to have them all mapped, like I said, and we'll talk about that as we go. We're going to start here at the top. This is our weapon select switch. Now I have this mapped completely, but what we really need to understand is what it's actually doing for us. If I press up on the weapon select switch, it takes me to the weapons page. This is where we set up weapons. I don't necessarily need to do that on the fly, so I could have that button mapped on a keyboard if I needed to. Now there isn't really a good way to get to that from the main page. In fact, I don't even think you can now that I think about it. So you definitely want to have it mapped somewhere, but what I'm saying is you don't need to devote one of your controls. Same thing when we press down, it's going to take us to the ASE setup bit page. And there's really, again, this is stuff that you're going to do on the ground. It's not something that you're really going to mess with in flight. Now left and right is important because it's going to bring up your actual weapon systems depending on which side you've got a weapon. So if we've got a 50 cal on the left, we select left, we'll get the 50 cal information, we select right. So this is how we actually activate the weapon, so you're definitely going to need that. Just below that is our display select switch, and kind of the same thing. We really don't need all of these mapped. If we select left, it's going to take us to our VSD or vertical situation display, and if we press left again, it's going to take us to our hover page. We talk about that in a separate video. And if we press down, it's going to take us to our horizontal situation display. And press down again, it's going to take us to our moving map. So you definitely, I would think, want those two because that's something you're going to use a lot in flight. If we press to the right, it's going to take us to the comm page. And if we press up, it's going to take us to the MMS. I don't really think that those are necessary. Again, if you have a lot of buttons and you want to map it, that's fine. I have it mapped just because it's the way it is, but it's not something that I'm using quite a bit. All right, just to the left of that, you see the bob up button, this little black button right here. This one I would definitely want to have mapped. It does two things. If we press it, it's going to drop a target wherever we are. So as we're flying along, if we were to take fire and I'm evading, I could hit that button, that's going to drop a target to where I was, and that just gives me something to reference. And additionally, when I'm in that hover page by using the VSD switch twice to the left, if I press and hold the bob up, it'll give me the hover bob up box. All right, so here underneath this cover is the weapons fire switch. As it stands right now, this is not a separate switch to have to raise this trigger guard. In real life, we really just kind of slid our thumb underneath it. It wasn't like this, you know, big step. You just slid your thumb up. It didn't even come up all the way, and then you could fire that. Now that is a 2 detent switch. If you're not using stingers, you probably won't need that first detent. If you're using stingers, you will, because it's going to uncage the missile. But otherwise, I would just go ahead and map the second stage of that. Just below that is the SCAS release. This is just essentially, it turns off the SCAS. In real life, this was important because, as I've talked about in other videos, we didn't like to have the SCAS on while we were sitting on the ground because we might pick up some ground resonance. So we would hit that button real quick and turn the SCAS off. In DCS, ground resonance hasn't been an issue, so I wouldn't worry about that. Looking back up here, we've got the trim release, and I've talked about this again in the flight video. That is for our force trim. If you fly with force trim, you're definitely going to want that button, but if you're not flying with it, you don't need it. Here we've got our missile activate switch, and this again is another Stinger specific weapon system. This is going to allow us to actually employ with the Stinger, so as long as you're using that weapon, you're going to want to have that mapped and handy. Over on the side, you can see kind of says missile step. This allows you to step through the missiles. If you're up Hellfires on norm, it's going to fire the inboard missile first, then the outboard. If for whatever reason you wanted to fire the outboard first, you would use the missile step. Now in real life, that's important because there may be some damage to the missile. There may be some reason that we want to fire the inboard missile. In DCS, I really can't imagine that being a scenario, so I don't even think I have this mapped, and I wouldn't suggest it. This red switch here is our flare dispenser, our manual flare dispenser. Again, if you're planning to use flares a lot, have that one mapped. Otherwise, you can allow the auto system and the CMOS to handle it for you. Now, this switch here on the right side is the optical display assembly switch. The ODA is this contraption that attaches to your MVGs and gives you like a heads-up display type scenario, kind of like the iHads in the Apache, but not as robust. However, the way that it's modeled in-game, this button itself is not listed as a stick option for the pilot cyclic stick. So I kind of struggled to see if you need to have that mapped or if you could just have that something on your keyboard. All right, so just to review, almost all of these I would definitely want to have mapped, other than the missile step, the up and down on the weapon select switch, the up and right on the display select switch, and the ODA switch that we just talked about. Everything else I would definitely want. And of course on the front we've got the trigger, and that's for your communications. You know, it depends on how you've got things set up. I'm sure like most people, if you've got SRS, you've probably just got it set up for the same buttons on your stick. So we're looking at quite a few buttons on this stick, but when we look at the collective, there's not nearly as many. All right, so of course we've got the ignition. We don't need to have that. The searchlight, you're probably not going to be doing a whole lot of that. These are related to changing radios and frequencies. Once again, I think with SRS, if you're using that, this probably is negated, though if you're using the VoIP, the DCS VoIP, I'm not sure how that interacts. I don't use it. I probably need to learn how. This is more for the searchlight. This is how to extend it, retract it, make it go left and right. You're probably not going to be using that too much. This is your heading hold. This is a 4-way switch. I never used it flying to real Kiowa, as I've talked about in a video about flying it. However, I have found some use to it, so it might be something worth mapping, at least playing with. The Inker Dinker switch for the RPM, definitely not something that you're going to mess with in flight. You're going to use it when you do engine start, but that's about it. This is our CMOS jettison. So if we press that, it's going to jettison the flares, and this is the cover. For me personally, this is not something I would have mapped. And then down here, this is how we actually fire the ISLID, which is the laser pointer that's attached to the 50 caliber. If you're going to do any night ops, I would definitely want to have this mapped to something. I think that's very handy to have. All right, so let's jump over and take a look at the Copilot. It's basically the same cyclic setup. It's just configured differently. The buttons are going to do different things. Now, the way that I have things set up, and granted, I have an embarrassment of riches when it comes to hardware. I have a collective, but I also use my throttle for this function. And so essentially I've got pilot stuff set up on the collective, and then I've got Copilot stuff set up on my throttle. So it makes it a little bit easier for me, but we'll talk about these buttons and what we need to have. The quick answer is pretty much all of them. We've got the laser fire switch. You're definitely going to be using that quite a bit. The field of view select is a 2-way switch up and down. Of course, your line of sight, so you can actually move the sight around. Your TV and TIS select, this is how you're going to rotate between day television and the thermal imaging system. This is your nav and target designate switches. You're definitely going to be using the target switch, but these also function for our hog. We're going to talk about the hog here in a few minutes. This is how you're going to rotate between manual and slave. So essentially, if you've got it forward, then you press it again, it's going to allow you to move it to manual. You press it again, it'll take it back forward. Or if you're in pre-point, you press that, it's going to rotate between going to the pre-point target that you've got stored in and being able to use it in manual mode. This is our force trim release switch and our SCAS release switch. So just like on the pilot cyclic, if we're using force trim, we'll need the force trim, and we definitely won't need the SCAS release. This little paddle right here, that is our point track. You're definitely going to be using that. Now here on the right side is our MMS freeze frame slash hog, which is hands-on general user interface. So if you want to play with your hog, you can use that button. That's going to bring up the hog interface menu. We can use our field of view switch to rotate up and down, and we can use that nav and target designate button to change through menus. We can also use our point track button to select inside the hog. Now, full disclosure, I have not dug into this, so I don't know how far down the rabbit hole this goes and how much functionality there is at the time of launch. It's something that you can play with, but that, at least now you know that really to get to this, you've got to have that hog button mapped to something, but otherwise you have the other controls to interface with that. All right, so the real doozy, of course, is the Copilot's Collective. Brace yourselves, because there's not one button on that thing. So as far as flying the aircraft and fighting the aircraft, there's really not a whole lot. I say that having a lot of buttons to my disposal, but even when I was flying with a Thrustmaster T16 million, by using that shift function and being able to set up modifiers, more than enough buttons to do everything that you need to do in a Kiowa. Now there are a couple things that you may want to add in that aren't normally on here just for ease of use, particularly the master arm, the master going to standby and armed. You know, what I'd like to do is just set it to standby before I take off, and then it's got a function to rotate between standby and armed. You might want to have that mapped somewhere easy to get to. Additionally, depending on how milsim you want to get, you might want to have the position lights and a collision lights mapped somewhere handy, and maybe your IR lights and formation lights. Now, of course, the last thing to talk about when we talk about button setup is the AI interface. And I know I've seen some criticism about the variety of buttons that Polychop use for the AI, and I totally understand that, and I can, to some extent, agree with it. I think it adds a lot of capability by having those different buttons instead of having to kind of go through menus. But I also understand that it can be a challenge for people that are lacking some buttons. So I think that if you've got some spare buttons, particularly on like the base of your throttle or something like that, those might be handy. You don't really need all of them, but there's quite a few that can get you through the most basic of flight for the AI. You can also, of course, use your keyboard for some of those that you may not need to just quickly get to. The things that I would definitely want to have mapped close at hand with the AI is the transfer of controls, and maybe particularly telling the AI to hover. All right, guys, well, I think that's probably it. Hopefully this gets you at least in the ballpark, in the right direction, and lets you know what you need to have versus what you think you might need to have. As always, a big thank you to YouTube Patreon members for supporting the channel, and thanks to you guys for watching these tutorials. Hopefully they're helpful for you, and I'm hoping that you're going to enjoy the Kiowa Warrior on its release very soon, probably before I even post this video. So we'll talk to you guys later. Take it easy.